Welcome, Cde Solly Mapaila, General Secretary of the South African Communist Party. We opened with your song request. If possible, can you tell us why the song means so much to you and what does it narrate? Because this song particularly speaks to the conditions of the working class and how the system has left the people to be, in terms of they have no home, they are wandering around, they are homeless people. If you can just walk us through why this song has a special place in you.
Well, thank you very much. All those conditions that he's wandering around, and so are many people because of the colonialist, the white minority racist regime that of course have taken over the country. And certainly, Miriam was one of the most outstanding revolutionaries in our cultural sphere, who traversed the rest of the continent and the world to talk about the liberation of our people and to call for their emancipation. So she was a revolutionary activist in the cultural front, and I must say, we haven't fully recognized her efforts or celebrated her input in the liberation struggle, really as a musical icon, but she was certainly more than that. In fact, we need to be playing more of a music across the board with regard to issues that she was raising, social issues, but certainly political issues that remains relevant today. That's why this song is very important for us as our background song of our Red Mic podcast.
Thank you. And taking cue from the social issues and political issues, it also links up to our topic today, which is on the preview of the South African budget, which also impacts on the day-to-day lives of the South African people. Welcome to SACP Online on the Red Mic Podcast Episode 3. I'm your host, Hlengiwe Nkonyane. Today we'll be getting into discussion, as mentioned before, around the South African budget, which was rescheduled to take place, is rescheduled to take place tomorrow, 12th of March. The reason for the postponement of the budget was due to much intense debate around the increase of the value-added tax from 15% to 17%, which is a 2% hike. The reasoning around this was because there needed to be some way to cover the plus or minus 60 billion rand shortfall in the national budget. To help us get into the perspective and depth into what the stance of the South African Communist Party, we have Comrade Cde Solly Mapaila, who is the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party. Welcome, Tate Mapaila. Comrade Solly, the SACP has been on the forefront opposing the 2% proposed hike of the value-added tax. This was seen when there was mass action and protest that we did participate in February when the budget was supposed to have been presented. It was under the banner of anti-austerity measures, budget cuts, and also against the value-added tax. Could you just take us down the stance of the SACP around those issues that were raised?
Yeah, thank you once more, Comrade Hlengiwe. The issue regarding our rejection of the VAT increase 2% was certainly that the VAT value-added tax system, it's a regressive tax in this form that it punishes every single person who participates in buying, whether rich or poor. Now, when you increase budget and targeting the poor, when in the other aspects of the budget you are saying you are trying to help the poor, it's illogical. So it is in this regard that the one reason we rejected the VAT increase. But certainly because already our VAT is too high, currently at 15%. It's too high. It should have long gone down. They indicated that possibly there will be zero rating another group of foodstuffs, which of course we know in the past it has been a minuscule intervention in a sense that they will come and mention certain grades of food in the same category as one area of zero rating. For instance, they will come and say in the field of meat, they will zero rate one section of different types of beef steaks, for instance. And I mean, the poor don't really get to participate in those kind of things. They eat the lowest level meat available. They don't have access to rump steak, sirloin steak, and those kind of things. They don't have, that thing is irrelevant to them. It's unaffordable to them. So when they say they are zero rating certain foodstuffs, as an example, they do that across various food categories to fool the poor that we've made extra measures, and in the packages that they present through the budget, you can then see that, no, here is an extra rate of about 50 or so of areas that they've zero rated. That means those ones, they will not have an increase. But like I say, it's irrelevant to the poor. And set again is the fact that they were looking for 60 billion rands. And in this 60 billion, the VAT that they're talking about, when we worked with some of the institutions, for instance, the Institute of Economic Justice had indicated when they were crunching their numbers that actually this thing will come to almost 2 billion. So it's an irrelevant to respond with that particular measure, but they needed it because it's an easy way to attack the poor and the working class. So we rejected that on that basis. We have certainly said that they must tax the rich. It is possible to tax the rich. They've not been increasing tax for highest categories of income earners in the country. In fact, on the contrary, over the years, these people have been getting tax decreases when other people are having difficulties. And certainly the inflation in the country that has increased, making the living of the cost of living too high, has made it impossible for the people to afford these new measures that they're talking about. So we see this as an attack on the working class, attack on the livelihoods of the people, and therefore we have said no measure should be taken that attacks the existing living crisis of the working people, that is the poor. That includes VAT, no increasing tax in their brackets, rather focus on increasing tax for the corporate. Also, corporate tax has not been increased in this country for quite some time. And also we have put proposal that the government must put measures to empower the South African Revenue Services to collect possibly an outstanding 800 billion rands that the Commissioner of SARS had indicated that if their systems were efficient, they should be able to get that. So that certainly should be the priority. That's big money out there. And they are not even touching it because they're interested in looking at what they have and use that as a weapon against the poor because they are guided by austerity measures, which simply focuses on cutting social expenditure. And we now know as well that they seem to be targeting the SRT grant. And we're really going to have another big fight with this government because if they continue to attack any single opportunity for the working people, the poor, to have some kind of an income, certainly they are on the wrong path and we're against that. That's why we've rejected this proposed budget, particularly from the VAT side, but generally on the other areas where we felt that they needed to spend enough resources to redevelop the country, to spend money on health, on education, and so forth. We have seen now with these budget proposals, many teachers will lose their jobs. They've increased in one or two sections, but minuscule, which would have no impact Workers have been retrenched, teachers in the Western Cape in their thousands. In other parts of the country, no more teachers have been employed. All of this will create serious problems going forward. We have seen some areas where there's an intervention, for instance, around the police. We need more resources in that regard. But the biggest intervention we can get, it's social security system that will generate an appropriate social protection for all our people, so that we don't have people fighting to go by on a daily basis to try and get some food, which is one of the cause of crime in our communities.
Thank you on that. The SACP has been on the forefront in opposing neoliberal policies such as the austerity measures. Could you perhaps elaborate what is the crisis that is created on such policies that are adopted by our government?
Well, the austerity measures, certainly one is that these are neoliberal economic interventions. In other words, the modern day capitalism is neoliberal economy, which says the government must not play a role in the main affairs of the economy. Even in areas where the government has historically been the dominant role player as a public sector, like in health, in education, in road, in transport, in telecommunication, those kind of areas, in energy or electricity, sanitation, those sections. Neoliberal systems say, leave all of that to the private sector. Mm-hmm. Let the private sector enter the space, make money, and the government can then get profits. That's what they say. So the government has been using that as a framework of any other intervention. That section of the economy, we largely call it, it's called by the IMF and the World Bank, as well as the OECD countries, they call it the network industries. So we have got bourgeois governments like our government handing over public affairs to the private sector, handing over responsibility for the provision of water and sanitation to the private sector, electricity or energy to the private sector, roads and transport to the private sector. And one of the things that they use, they neglect each of these areas to collapse. Mm-hmm. So that when they call for the private sector intervention, everyone in society wants some kind of intervention. So they are happy with any other intervention as long as it will sort the problem out. So that is why we now have a water crisis in this country, when we should not be having a water crisis. Even in the midst of heavy rains, we have a water crisis. We have serious problems of electricity. This was also opening up the way for independent power producers to come in, as well as to comply with the European interest about climate change, using the funding that they have given to us. Initially, they said this was going to be a grant, but we now know it's no longer a grant. It's actually repayable loans that are given to countries that are transitioning to non-carbon emission energy generation systems. This and others, transport, for instance, you have seen how the private sector has destroyed our roads. Mm-hmm. And when people are condemning the problems in our roads, they don't talk about the role of the private sector. But it was because the legislators abandoned the primacy of railroad for goods transportation in our country, and therefore the improvement of the rail infrastructure in favor of the trucking industry getting a lot of loads on the road. And they've now destroyed almost entirely our major road networks, particularly the city-to-city or interprovincial networks, completely destroyed, potholed everywhere. Mm. Those people are getting away with murder. But at the core of that is these neoliberal policies that have been passed by government in the name of efficiency of the markets. And there's never been efficiency when a system is created to impoverish the majority, and it is called efficient. There are other areas, for instance, whether it's in defunding of public health, which has led to a health crisis in this country, where majority of our hospitals cannot cope with many people that are coming into the hospitals, and there's been mushrooming on the contrary of the private sector healthcare, which has now become a full-blown huge system, living effectively on the carcass of the public sector, but destroying the public health economy. The same as in education, it's mushrooming of private sector institutions and so forth. So all of this and others are so important that neoliberalism as a system has taken away public sector role into the private hands. At the same time, the government, to complement that, keep on cutting social expenditure in its budget so that the private sector can increase its visibility and role in that section where they are defunding it, including in education, health, and now road transport and energy and so forth. That's why we're now having all this crisis across the board in the field that was necessarily a public sector field. We have now destroyed that, or we're trying to save that in our kind of programs and intervention. That's why this budget, the first task of this budget is to move away from a neoliberal framework, move away from austerity, and look into the interests of the people. Then we can have an appropriate budget.
With that being said, what then are the alternatives that the SACP are putting forth that the government can employ that it doesn't really harm the working class and the poor at the core and actually saving the rich?
Yes, we have made several calls. Amongst them, firstly, is to stop these austerity measures as the foundation of budgeting, so we can have a people's budget. In the march we had to Parliament, and there's another march tomorrow in Cape Town, which we fully endorse and support. The march we had at the previous budgetary system, we joined various organizations. The institution called AIDC had collected hundreds of thousands of petitions for the people's budget, where the people were raising their issues. And we summarized those into few pages to present to government as the people's budget, alternatives to what the government can do. One of those, of course, is to stop the austerity measures, that is budget cuts, and support social security system in the country by transforming the SRD grant into a national income grant, basic national income grant for any other person in the country. And when some of the economists have made some presentations in the past, including the Institute of Economic Justice, they have indicated the possibility that if you do it this way, you won't even stress the current budget. So that's one area to cushion the poor from an extreme form of abject poverty, which they are already in. Then we have said, tax the rich, the corporates, because they've been going scot-free on many things. And there are multiple areas in which you can tax the rich. The financial transactions, for instance. The financial sector in this country continues to make huge profits. Even during COVID-19, all the major banks were raking huge profits in the midst of an economic crisis and a social crisis and a health crisis. So, but because you have a government of neoliberals controlled by the strongest instrument in the economic section, that is the financial sector today, which is also driven by the neoliberal ideology, you then have had a government posture that ignores what happens in this sector. That's why, for instance, they could not even build public financial institutions. Instead, they've been destroying the remaining public finance institutions like the Post Bank and so forth, those that they have kept, like the IDC, PIC, and so forth, they've been using them to provide funding for the private sector, not for the public sector in the main. So this is one of the major interventions, including how you can utilize resources within the public sector system, including in the PIC, to recapitalize some of our economic interventions, including on health, on housing, and other social needs of our country. So that has not been happening because the government has been focusing on diverting every single resource to the private sector, not to the people. And yet is the government elected by the people, not by the corporates, but is the government that works for the corporates. That's a serious problem.
Taking into that, the party is always calling on government to invest on state-owned entities and calling on how that is for the positive on the public good use of everything that is needed. Can you take us through why the party stands very firmly on saving the SOEs and the role that it's playing in the economy, rather than the narrative that the more investment it's done on the SOEs, it then suffocates the economy, and hence that's why the government needs to disinvest or privatize those SOEs?
Yes, privatization is the fundamental policy of neoliberalism that complements government austerity measures. They've been attacking public sector role. In fact, what we are calling for is a prominent role of the public sector, including utilizing state-owned enterprises for strategic interventions in the economy. In this case, we have had a government that doesn't recapitalize the SOEs. In fact, any profitable SOE, its monies or its profits have been taken back into the treasury, into government, for the general good of society. So when they face a problem, instead of them being recapitalized, the neoliberals have been using this term that they are being bailed out. And they increased this term that the government must stop bailing out state entities and not indicating, not even evaluating what each one of them had contributed to the national fiscals or to the general economic well-being. So it's a fallacy, but it's an ideological position of the neoliberals, of the capitalists, that destroy public sector economy, which is anchored on state-owned enterprises, and hand over that function or those functions to the private sector, whether it's in transport, in telecommunications. We've seen, for instance, the destruction of our telecommunication industry here, including the unforgivable sale of our spectrum to the duopoly of Vodacom and MTN. Completely unacceptable. In the period when society requires more spectrum for digital transformation and for the development of new productive forces within the digital space, the government that professes itself to be following or wanting to embrace the so-called fourth industrial revolution, which is generally computational development system at a higher rate, or digital economic system, they sell the spectrum, the very same fundamental instrument that you use. It's like you say you want to do farming, but you don't want water and soil. But you think you can have productive interventions in that regard. It doesn't mean that it can happen in the future as technology develops. But this is just a basic example of how lost a neoliberal government can be. It doesn't know what it is doing, whether it is coming or going, because whatever are demands of capital, you will never reach them. You will try to please them as much as you can. You will destroy every other thing. That is why state-owned entities have been destroyed one by one because of this intervention. Some years ago, there was a plan actually for the development and recapitalization of the post office, which could have led to, I don't know if you know, an entity called Postnet. It became a private entity. That entity, its functions should have been the post office function. But neoliberals did not want to recapitalize the post office to enter that particular space and lead the new area of transformation and development in the postal services. So ultimately, that is postal and courier services. Ultimately, post office lost out. When it entered into a major problem, its competitors were smiling all the way to the bank. And instead of the post office being further recapitalized and repurposed, it's been attacked, it's been condemned as a failed state entity. The same with others. So this is part of the problem that we're having with a government that do not respect the public economy or its public mandate. Because you can have a mandate from the people, but call on the corporates to do what you have promised the people to do. And you know, I don't like to make this example, but that's the closest that people can understand. If you look at the United States of America, for instance, you have a government that can meet the obligations of its society on the basis of elections, because those ones, they use decrees. And the state, they can discipline capital. Here, we have a government that has been disciplined by capital. Capital commands here, and that's a fundamental problem. So we need to change that posture. We need mass mobilization, the people to understand that they cannot elect a government that subjugates itself to the interests of capital. Everything that capital says goes. They destroy everything and never take responsibility for anything. That's the lunacy of South African politics, actually. I don't understand why our people are not rising up against this kind of a thing. Because it's completely irrational and unacceptable that we can have politics that detaches itself from society. In other words, we have stolen politics by the political elite that uses politics in the name of the people for their own interests and the interests of corporates, not for the interests of the people. So we need the capacity in which we have called for this over the years to build state interventions in various fields, whether it's in housing and in other areas. Major social needs of our society, we should have the public role. At the moment, there's no possibility. If you come from the township, for instance, let's say you are born in Soweto. Mm-hmm. If you can't find a place to stay and you are unemployed at your own home or your family home, if you are an adult and so forth, you don't have a place to stay, you are without doubt going to join a squatter camp. If you have some income, you can go to the back rooms. In some places, hire a room and stay there. If not, squatter camp. No alternative. No state intervention. The state process of the RDP houses, as we know, has been corrupted badly because it has been tenderized, not driven as a public entity and even as a basis for social need, where, for instance, if I need a social housing, I'm given access to a housing. If I no longer need it, somebody can come in. But because of this private sector model of ownership, everyone wants to own. Even the state, in their interventions, they create this and hand over these houses to individuals. And that's where corruption also crept in. But it's important that people should have houses. They should have housing, including through the RTP model, but it's an insufficient model, that one. But the bottom line is that we have also called for intervention from this public sector of this kind of areas so that we resolve these problems. We now have a major crisis in our higher education system, for instance. No access to tertiary institutions, universities, and everything else. Then there's been mushrooming of private sector education system. In our public sector education system, all those who cannot be admitted in the public sector education system, they can go to the private sector. They never say no. They admit everyone because they are chasing money. So that's part of the problem when you have a state failing its population because it relies on instruments of capital to serve society. And capital is costly, at least in this country.
Just touching on what you just started on the end, on issues of NEFSAs, the fact that it has been noted that the budget burden can no longer carry NEFSAs in terms of the missing middle and the booming access to education, the people that are coming in, meaning there's a decrease in the budget allocated to NEFSAs, and then also the cry out that is being stated on the national health insurance, that such policies that have been taken also are a burden to the budget of the country, which then leads to all these other the measures that government says they need to take in order to deliver to everything that the policies have been saying. What's the take of the SACP around those issues and the importance, in fact, of government not taking or having a budget cuts on, especially on access to education, on NEFSAs, and also ensuring that the national health insurance is actually implemented without the cry out saying there's no budget for it?
Look, there are serious problems in the higher education space, or let's say in the education space. In this country, we have schools that have been abandoned by government, closed and abandoned in different communities. Even now, just over the weekend, I was in a program in Limpopo. We get approached by one chief in a village fighting to keep their school because the schools have been attacked for austerity reasons, for projections reasons. For instance, to project that in this particular area, if a school doesn't gets 100% matric or is getting lower matric rates, the people in the circuit get affected by this because they feel that school is dragging their circuit down. They play chess balls to close schools. We have schools that are closed in the townships. In Soweto, we're dealing with one critical problem there. Many schools that have been closed, some taken over by individuals, even by criminals, some by businesses, and some by communities. But generally, there's been a problem in education in this country. But we have enough resources to cater for education in this country. We even have enough institutions. For instance, there's no reason why you should have so many young people who pass matric and only a fraction of them get admitted into institutions of higher learning, including TVET colleges. When we have high schools, which can be turned around as universities in the evening, for an example, or as colleges in the evening. When we have colleges that can serve as a multiple purpose, college by the day, university by the night. So, because what's the major difference is the curriculum. The administration can be one entity, facilities and so on and so forth. These two institutions can share certain things. But we've had poor planning for quite some time. We've had sectoralism of the highest level for quite some time in our country. Even when we have serious problems in particular communities, no clinics and everything else, but there's a school that can provide 2-3 classes for clinical purposes, people are still waiting for 10, 15 years of budgeting and lobbying to get a clinic done. So we just have a government that is anti-people, essentially, that is unable to respond to the needs of the people because it has embraced an archaic modeling of planning. That's why this budget is insufficient. It's just irrelevant to the needs of our society. It's a minuscule intervention, whatever intervention that they make. So when you ultimately have many of these students who pass matric and they stay at home, they can't find spaces in universities. In some, when they find universities, the universities do not even care. We've been dealing with cases of some of students from Gauteng, for instance, who are in Cape Town, who have been admitted by universities there in Cape Town, but they can't provide them accommodation. And these are students from poor families. They must now go and search for themselves accommodation in different communities, in different places. Completely unacceptable, but it is related to poor planning by government, to government that doesn't also talk to each other, to government that functions in silos, that something in health should not affect something in education and vice versa, and across other departments. So this is an area that must be sorted out as soon as possible. But it's an area that the Communist Party should develop a strategic interest and rebuild a society, a new society, based on interventions that are not necessarily focused on the necessity of this current bourgeois government. This current bourgeois system is not working for the people, not at all. So when you look at the defunding of education, because in practice, in real terms, there's been decrease in funding to support a student at tertiary levels over the years. The government can do better. We've got former College of Educations in this country that are dilapidated, destroyed. One in my own area in Cathoras, completely destroyed. No longer existing. That was a public facility. And yet we're running short of space for students. So this is part of the problem. And even when these facilities are abandoned, they are not seen as facilities of education. They are seen as facilities of a particular sector in education. That is why those schools that are abandoned in Soweto, we're checking the list there just a couple of weeks ago, because we're making an intervention with the unemployed doctors about utilizing some of those schools. And even to talk about unemployed doctors, it's another, it's something that is difficult to comprehend and accept that this is the reality in our country. But it's because of austerity measures, budget cuts. They don't value life. They don't value well-being of society. They value budget chess games. How much we have here, how much, they don't care. What is this, how much going to do? So that's part of the problem that we have. So we need increase in education funding, particularly for post-matric education, TVET college education, but also to transform this education and get even the private sector playing a role, contributing to the development of society. Because the public that takes children to school taken over by the private sector, they pay a small levy, whether it's through the CITAs and so forth. It's insufficient. And we need strategic overall and interventions, even of this CITA field, so that we can have resources that can appropriately build institutions, repurpose education for the current needs of society, rather than simply for the industry that is completely lost. I mean, we can relate this thing with the decline in manufacturing in our country and the unemployment rate and the fact that the skills that are being produced are not relevant for the current economy. But in an economy that it's so underdeveloped, we have no roads in many of our public, our communities, no good infrastructure across the board. And of course, South Africa, comparative to other African countries, is a little bit better. But we don't have here, where majority of our people are living. That on its own, it's a foundation for creating an ending employment, an ending skills and capacity of a country. But the plans are not there to tackle that because big capital just want to absorb the best that they can get from the minority of the generals in society. And the state that has given the economy to big capital cannot redeploy the purpose, these people anywhere. They can take you to university, but they don't know what to do with you after that university. That's why they take people and train them as doctors, as a state. After that, they don't know what to do with them. They keep them on the street. completely unacceptable and irrational, poor planning. That is why the overhauling of this budgetary system, these interventions that we are making, should not just stand as a protest against austerity budget alone, which is important that must continue. We should transform ourselves towards people's budgeting so that we can tackle the problems where they exist and rebuild the economy anew. That is why we are, as the Communist Party, launching a program going into communities. We call it the Red Caravan. In this program, we'll be working with the communities primarily outside the role of government. Basically building self-reliance of the communities, because the communities have been over-reliant on government that has failed them dismally and is not going to change quite soon.
Mapaila, of topical of the people are speaking about the ever-increasing national debt, not more than 1% increase in our economy, the high levels of unemployment, and the fact that all of those things then take a burden on us South Africans to foot the bill on our borrowing spree. Is our borrowing justifiable? Is there reasoning behind the debt ever increasing and us never reaching a point where we are? I think there was once a point where we were debt-free. I'm not sure if it was with President Thabo Mbeki or if it was after him, where we reached a point where we had completed all our debts and there was a celebration. So the issue here is that the administration here from the previous one and this one, the sixth one, has been going on a borrowing spree. Is the borrowing that is being done for the good of the public, is it justifiable? And maybe is it justifiable that we should carry the burden when the budget speech is speaking about the burdens and the shortfalls that government is facing due to issues of the national debt?
Yeah, big issues, Comrade Lengwe. Firstly, let me say, I don't remember the point you are raising about being debt-free, but that would have been, I remember when President Thabo Mbeki once said that the problem we have was not money, but it didn't necessarily mean that we were debt-free, but he was basically saying we had enough resources, the problem was how to spend it. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that we must, going forward, correct. The issue regarding borrowing, firstly, it depends, borrowing for what? But governments borrow all the time. South African government, they borrow almost money every week. Every Friday, they borrow money from the private sector institutions and everywhere else. We have debated these things in the past by saying, as a sovereign state, we need to create a mechanism in which we also create the public banking system, because we can also borrow from the public banking system, but we've been borrowing from the private sector and the commercial banks, including the international entities, both for the public funding as well as for the private funding, and using some guarantors as a government for those kind of borrowings, and of course paying these borrowings through the tax regime in our country. The issue is that we have said majority of South Africa's borrowing has been with the local currency. So in other words, we have a fiction of this debt burden on the country, because the larger part of it is rand-denominated borrowing or debt. So it's something we can tackle quicker. But we also have a problem where, following the neoliberal book, I remember when the government was borrowing money, can't remember, it was from the the IMF. Yeah, I think it was from the IMF or the World Bank, one of the two institutions, during COVID. They borrowed money, which would came to between 60 and 90 billion rand, depending on the rate at the time that it came in. But that money, we did not necessarily need to borrow. That's why we even characterize that borrowing as a political borrowing. It was not an economic borrowing. It was not because the economy didn't have that money or the economy needed that money. It was because the forces that be led by this current Minister of Finance, it's a neoliberal addict, completely. They needed to appease their masters in Washington, in London and in Paris, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD countries, that South Africa is on the right path, if you like, on the path of neoliberalism, to assure them. They went to borrow for symbolism, not for need or necessity, so that you can always owe something to the IMF and the World Bank. But you know that once you go to these institutions, it's part of their neoliberal rule book, the money that you borrow must be subjected to particular terms. For instance, one of the conditions of the borrowing by the IMF and the World Bank is that your currency must be devalued. So in other words, once you enter that path of borrowing from them, you're never going to pay back the money. Because they retain the control of devaluing your currency. They decide about the value of your currency every single time. So no matter how much you pay more than what you owe them. In few years, they still don't care. You still owe them. That is why we have raised this question about national currency, national sovereignty, and policy sovereignty as a country, including economic sovereignty, that must be debated by the movement, by the liberation forces and the progressive forces in this country, so that we stop this being straitjacketed by the IMF and the World Bank in terms of what needs to be done. You see what Minister Godongwana is doing with his team. Even the previous finance ministers have been following the same thing, is to use the complete rule book. It's like they're in a classroom. So in that classroom, they tell you, okay, you must have this income, must have this expenditure, this and that. So they think a national budget is a household budget. This is not a household budget. It's a budget of a country, budget of a people. Budget affecting millions of people who are dying of hunger, who are homeless. Now, they treat this thing as a household thing. It doesn't work like that. They have no conception of national sovereignty and identity of a government and the dignity of a people. But of course, because they are our leaders, they are elected, then we have to stomach that. This issue of borrowing has been hyperboled in our country. In other words, it has been over-dramatized. You can go and check the various countries, how much they borrow and so forth. Go and even check the US government. The US government has a budget of about 18 trillion US dollars. It has a deficit budget of 36 trillion. Double the number of its own budget. Now, here, we can't do anything for the people because we can't pay so and so. But we keep on borrowing the same. We are addicted to our omashonisa. Because that's what the IMF and the World Bank have turned themselves into. But they are the imperialist loan sharks. They are now acting on the interests of their countries, not for the interest of our people. But it's a fundamental issue, this question of borrowing. In fact, we had at one point said, let's have a discussion about this concept of borrowing as a country, rather than leave this thing to politicians in this regard, because no longer revolutionaries, but mere politicians in government. Possibly, when we deal with this question of the national dialogue, this question must come in. National sovereignty of our country, including its economic sovereignty. Once we debate that, we deal with that, then we can then release massive resources to respond to the challenges that we face as a country.
Thank you on that. I think we have just 10 minutes left, but I'll just try to get a few last two questions. The first one, the Politburo statement after the postponement of the initial budget speech in February actually called for the alliance to be consulted and for a meeting or an urgent meeting to take place. Has that taken place? Has there been any consultation with the alliance in regards to the budget speech that will be tabled tomorrow?
No, there's not been any consultation. We called for that. We confirmed some meetings which were postponed. Started with the Alliance Secretary that was postponed. The bilateral with the ANC that was supposed to be yesterday, which was also postponed. So no consultation, no discussions. But of course, we were not also going to just accept last-minute consultation to endorse something that we cannot change. We want meaningful consultation, constructive consultations, not tick box exercise program that we have had a meeting of the alliance and of no consequence. No, we're not interested in that. We want, if the alliance meets, it must discuss properly issues affecting the people and how to resolve them. And in this case, it's so sad that once again, even since the government of national unity, neoliberal unity, we have not met as an alliance to have a proper discussion about the moment we face. The people are on their own. And that's why various forces will come up, create spaces, and take sections of our society, including of our mass base and our support base, to lead them. But certainly there's nothing we can do in the event that the arrogance of leadership is displayed in this form, that no matter the outcry, people are just doing things the always business as usual for them. But we'll have to turn the corner at some point. We'll have to change this posture through our action, through reorganizing society and changing the balance of forces so that we can no longer be ignored like it is now.
Noting that there hasn't been any consultation, nor the fact that the SACP will not take a last-minute consultation, what in the broad economy in terms, does the SACP expect the budget to say tomorrow?
We said it before that we expect the budget we expect the retention, firstly, of the SRD grant. That grant is very important for this grant that goes to the poorest of the poor in our society. And because this was already budgeted for in the medium-term budget policy, that the money is there for the SRD. We hope it's not going to be a casualty. We'll be disappointed if in their chess games they try and touch this area. We'll want to see more commitment to fund health sector, particularly the introduction of the national health insurance, because this will guarantee our people to have full access to good health across the board in every hospital without being prejudiced on the basis of affordability or their status in society or lack of medical aid or something like that. We'll appreciate that there's intervention to save jobs in the education sector of teachers, as well as to fund both the police and our army to do their duties proper. And we'll also want to enter into a discussion within the framework of the alliance about the role of the army during peacetime here at home. That is peacetime in a sense of no active combat with the direct enemy across our borders, so that we harness all the energies and the efforts that we have as a society for the development needs of our people. Of course, the interventions in the education sector, including for university students, funding for NSFAS and other universities, building more schools and universities, but converting those that already exist becomes an important dimensional thinking that is required from government. If they embrace those kind of things, we think we can work with all of them progressively to make sure that the interventions reaches out to our people. But the way things are, we're not expecting any miracle. We're just expecting that the arrogance will be displayed. There will be a continued attack on the poor, the corporates, and the rich will be left scot-free because this is their government. So there's no way in which they can have a government that attacks them. So their people will use this platform to protect the corporate interest at the expense of the people. Unfortunately, that's where the situation is today.
On your parting words as we're closing, what message would you say to the working class and the poor in regards to the economy and the budget, and how can they participate to ensure that they take forward the people's budget and make government listen and hopefully implement what the people demand?
It's a very important point, Tlingiwe. Firstly, the workers and the poor, the working class, must support this march against austerity measures and neoliberal policy framework, which is expressed in the main through the statement by the Treasury, including the budget statement. So the marches in Cape Town should be fully supported by our members who endorse the marches, together with other forces, including the trade unions and other progressive organizations, community-based organizations, including our ally COSATU, which is very important, playing an important role in this regard, including application for Section 77, which will allow workers to have free participation in this budget protest without being punished. So we call on them to participate in that. But we also call on our people to explore, in the absence of a caring government, in the absence of a government of the people, to look into alternatives of sustainable livelihoods so that they don't have to wait only for government to intervene, to begin to embrace the concept of self-reliance for their sustainable livelihoods, because the cost of living has reached a crisis point and is unaffordable for the majority of our people. So when we are this helpless to wait for a government that is going to inflict more pain, it's something that we believe that people can be doing something for themselves rather than wait for this outcome. Otherwise, we say the people must remain positive, but create their own alternatives, including alternative people's budget.
Thank you very much, General Secretary, Comrade Africa Solly Mapaila, for joining us today on a very intense discussion on the budget. I hope all our audience, from the viewers and the listeners out there, had some take-ins on what was being said, and actually are leaving here feeling there's a sense of hope that there's something that can be done irrespective of the budget that would be tabled tomorrow. Please do remember to like our social media pages, the South African Communist Party on Facebook, and do follow our YouTube channel and like the notification button so that you are kept notified on all upcoming episodes of the Red Mic podcast series. From us here on the studio, goodbye.
Thank you very much.